Okay, so now draining out of the kidneys. How does the urine finally drain out? Well, through an organ called the ureters. Two of them, actually, one from each kidney. So basically, the ureters are made up of these narrow, long tubes that extend from the renal pelvis, so, where the calyces join, and extend down through and basically enter into the urinary bladder. So they're long, narrow tubes, and you can see here that there's connective tissues surrounding a transitional epithelium so that they can stretch a little bit as they're filling with urine. There's a muscular layer that helps control the diameter of the lumen, and then there's adipose tissue on the outside to help protect and insulate the organs to keep them safe. Because remember, the kidneys are retroperitoneal. They're in the back, behind the digestive system, behind the peritoneal cavity, or behind the peritoneal membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. So the ureters are kind of situated back there as well. And what they do is they basically drain urine from the renal pelvis into the bladder. So let's talk about the urinary bladder. Basically, it's a very muscular, elastic organ, and it's able to expand tremendously, and it has a mucous membrane arranged like rugae. Like, remember the stomach, how inside the stomach there are those bumps on the inside, the rugae? Very much like the stomach mucosa, the urinary bladder has a mucosa, a mucous membrane that helps protect the underlying tissues, and the rugae allow the urinary bladder to expand as it fills. And basically, it's a storage place for urine before voiding occurs. So here's the structure, an artist's rendition of the structure of the urinary bladder. So here are the individual little rugae inside. So as the urinary bladder stretches out laterally, those rugae flatten out, and basically it's a way to allow expansion to occur. Think about it kind of like elastic, right? On the outside, there is, right here, here's the cut in the peritoneum. So the peritoneum right here above the urinary bladder would be the digestive system, right? So the urinary bladder is below the peritoneum. Here's the ureter extending down to the very bottom, actually, of the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder doesn't fill from the top, it fills from the bottom. Now, the openings of the ureters here help construct this region called the trigon, because yeah, it looks like a triangle, right? And so here are part of, you can see kind of the rugae here, and what they've done here is they've cut the urinary bladder open so that you can see the interior portion of it. Right here is the internal urinary sphincter that we do not have control over. This is the prostaic urethra. In females, it's very short. In males, it's quite a bit longer. The prostate gland surrounds the prostaic urethra that extends down into the spongary urethra, which is present in males. So basically, this region right here is where the voiding begins. The bulbourethral glands, don't worry about that a whole lot, but it's associated with and close to the external urinary sphincter, which is what we do have control over. So this is voluntary. All right, and the internal urinary sphincter is involuntary. I'll say invol. So the urethra itself is a narrow tube that extends from the urinary bladder, interior of the body, to the exterior of the body where urine is emptied. It's lined again with mucous membrane to help protect the tissues. And the opening of the urethra is called the urinary meatus. So a meatus is an opening. Remember, we had the acoustic meatus, the hole, the ear hole. Well, this is the urinary hole. And basically, the urethra is the passageway for urine from the bladder to the exterior of the body, and it's definitely much longer in the male reproductive tract because the urethra serves two purposes in males. Number one, urination, and secondly, the dissemination of reproductive fluid, which is called semen from the body, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Nutrition is kind of the fancy word for urination, okay? Let me see if I can trying to put my hand on the side to make my writing a little more stable. And so the definition of micturition is the passage of urine from the body, also called urination or voiding. We don't call it peeing, even though, like, if you're working in a hospital and you're working real fast and you're a nurse, you might say, oh, so-and-so needs to pee, okay, whatever. But usually micturition is the formal terminology. The regulatory sphincter is the involuntary sphincter, is that internal urethral sphincter, which we looked at right here. Here's the internal. And the voluntary is the external urinary sphincter. All right. And that's the one that that's that little band of muscle that, you feel like you need to go to the bathroom. That's the one you're controlling. And so the bladder wall permits the storage of urine with very little increase of pressure on the external until the internal urethral sphincter opens, and then pressure is obvious. So emptying is a reflex, micturition is a reflex, and it happens in 4 steps. The reflex starts when there is a stretch reflex initiated by the stretch of the bladder wall. So as the urinary bladder fills, those rugae kind of allow the expansion of the urinary bladder, and that's detected by stretch receptors in the muscle itself. That starts the micturition reflex. The bladder wall then begins contracting smoothly, gently, allowing the internal sphincter to relax. So that's kind of the initial stages of micturition. And then the external sphincter relaxes when we hopefully decide to do so, and then urination occurs. Urenesis is the involuntary urination, usually in young children. And so micturition, it is a reflex, but we also do learn to control it when we are young. Enuresis happens oftentimes when children get very scared. When they get scared, they have a fight or flight reflex that can also trigger the micturition reflex. And in that particular case, it's the child is usually very scared and pretty embarrassed and kind of confused. So it's kind of a scary thing for little kids. So urinary retention happens when urine is produced, but it's not voided. And so urinary retention can happen when there are failures of the central nervous system or reflexes are starting to not be very effective. Urinary suppression is when no urine is being produced, but the bladder is okay. So the bladder is sometimes damaged or something abnormal is happening when urinary retention is happening. Urinary suppression is when the kidneys aren't making urine. And then incontinence is when urine is being voided involuntarily. And this can happen for a number of reasons. It's not the same thing as the enuresis. Okay, enuresis is just the reflex happening at an inappropriate time. Incontinence, on the other hand, can happen as a result of a spinal cord injury, being a paralysis happening, abnormal function of the bladder. The bladder might be damaged. The bladder might be bruised, say, for example, after a car accident. If somebody, if their body hit the steering wheel, sometimes the urinary bladder can be bruised. A stroke can cause incontinence, but basically it's any sort of disease process that causes urine to be voided involuntarily. Certain types of incontinence include issues that have to do with the urge to urinate. Stress sometimes can cause incontinence, and the reflex itself may be not operating appropriately. So let's talk briefly about a few renal and urinary disorders. Obstructive disorders stop the normal flow of urine. And so this can when this happens, urine actually starts backing up into the kidneys, causing something called hydronephrosis. And hyponephrosis or hydronephrosis is basically urine backing up all the way up to the nephron, sometimes all the way up to the glomerulus, and that causes actual kidney damage. So what we're looking at down here in this picture, okay, is a diseased or a damaged kidney where we have renal caliculi. And basically what we're showing here is a large kidney stone in the center of the renal pelvis of an individual kidney. Kidney stones themselves, or renal calculi, okay, calculi like calcium, right, can block the individual ureters, usually one at a time, right? And this causes really, really intense bad pain, which is called renal colic. And so in this particular case, the kidney pain usually starts high up in the back where the kidneys reside, and then starts traveling down through the tracking with the ureters as the kidney stone travels down the ureter, if it's able to travel through the ureters. If it can't do that, that's a problem. Tumors, or renal cell carcinoma, which is kidney cancer, and sometimes bladder cancer, can also affect and block the removal of urine from the urinary system. And so in that particular case, if a renal cell carcinoma occurs, you see a lot of blood in the urine. And I should say also with kidney stones, there's also a lot of blood with the urine. Now, when blood was present in the urine, it doesn't usually look bright red like you're seeing here in this picture of the kidney, okay? This looks pretty red and juicy and bloody. Blood in the urine actually looks kind of brownish. It looks kind of like soda, like Coke. So if anyone ever sees, what they call, or like soy sauce, Coca-Cola urine, that's usually blood actually in the urine, because the blood appears more brown in the urinary stream because of the other compounds present in urine. Urinary tract infections, or UTIs, are usually caused by bacteria, and oftentimes gram-negative bacteria. Urethritis, here we are again with itis, inflammation of the urethra. So the urethra, initially during a UTI, the urethra can become inflamed and itchy. Cystitis, the inflammation or infection of the urinary bladder, usually comes next. By that point in time, there's usually kind of a burning sensation along the urethra, and sometimes a burning sensation in the urinary bladder. Some people say it kind of feels like it's burning in there. Pyelonephritis is the inflammation going all the way up the renal pelvis into the kidney. So at this point, the urinary tract infection has gone up into the kidneys, and that actually starts some other processes. Usually what will end up happening is there's a lot of blood found in the urine, and the individual is starting to, the kidneys may start going into the initial stages of failure. There are different types of pyelonephritis. Some are acute, which would be infectious from bacteria, but some are the result of autoimmune actions. So basically, the immune system attacking kidney tissue. Sorry. And then we have our hydronephritis, which is the enlargement of the renal pelvis and the calyces as a consequence of blockage. And the blockage could be a number of different things, like kidney stones. Other things that could be a problem are glomerular disorders. So the glomerulus, that fenestrated capillary bed inside of Bowman's capsule, this sometimes occurs where the capsular membrane itself and the whole renal corpuscle starts functioning poorly. That's called nephrotic syndrome. Okay, and it comes with other disorders, proteinuria. This is where you do find protein in the urine. When that happens, the first thing they start thinking of, oh, there's dysfunction in the glomerulus. For some reason, protein is getting through. They start looking for certain types of proteins like albumin, so low plasma protein. Hypoalbuminemia happens when protein gets passed into the urine. So in this particular case, they would look at albumin levels in the blood and start looking at, okay, what kind of proteins are present in the urine, because albumin is one of the first proteins to pass into the urine. And then edema. Edema is just swelling. That's a consequence of water getting trapped somewhere. So tissue swelling caused by loss of water from plasma also results in hypoalbuminemia. Other renal and urinary disorders, acute glomerular nephritis is caused by an autoimmune response or a delayed immune response to a streptococcal infection. This particular type of infection sometimes causes autoimmune. Don't worry about that. You'll hear about it in Bio-18. And then chronic glomerulonephritis is basically a really slow immune mechanism where the individual's immune system, the white blood cells, start attacking the nephron, basically, and eventually it'll lead to renal failure. So this is much more, the chronic glomerulonephritis is much more of the autoimmune disease. Kidney failure, renal failure occurs when the kidney doesn't function well. Acute renal failure. This usually happens can happen in a UTI, but it's reversible. But chronic, this is where you have a disease process that leads to basically the failure of the kidney. That can lead to high urine levels or uremia, and eventually the kidney fails.